An idea repeatedly appears in many of the most influential texts from the Enlightenment, and thus, whether we recognize it or not, influences a lot of the core assumptions nested within our modern institutions, culture, and societies, built as they are on a bedrock of liberalism. Whether through a Lockean conception of rights, a Hobbesian vision of state power, a Smithian justification for currency, or a Rousseauian scorn for institutions, all have in common a vision of man before civilization and a unified method for the development of civilization and states. In many of their own texts, it is referred to as the state of nature, governed by certain natural laws, but I will refer to it, in totality, as liberal anthropology. The state of nature, it is supposed, was one prior to society, in which man existed as individual entities roaming around the wilderness. When they would happen upon other men, their conduct would be regulated by one of a competing set of conduct codes, determined either by rational calculations and reciprocity, or emotional irrationality. It is then from this original vision of a pure, uncluttered mankind that conclusions about how society ought to be ordered are drawn. If this vision of man appears to be preferable to the status quo of their respective times, then state and social influence on their citizenry ought to be minimized. If it is viewed as being less preferable, then interference ought to be maximized. As such, Rousseau laments the loss of our previous harmony when he says, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." Conversely, Hobbes wishes to do everything necessary to stave off what he views as an otherwise inevitable war of every man against every other man. In the other two aforementioned cases, the ideas furthered using liberal anthropology as justification have done a better job of surviving in something resembling their original form, using different justifications. But at times one cannot help but see this as an attempt to justify the idea post hoc, after it becomes evident that the original basis was faulty. So why is it faulty? A number of methods can be used to falsify it, so I will run through a few of these. Evolutionarily, many of the described features of civilization that are explained by liberal anthropology are evolutionarily advantageous in some way, and thus manifest in other related species, which by extension would almost certainly apply to previous iterations of humanity before we became something recognizably human. Ergo, the social structures predate humanity. Archaeologically, we do not see one unified vision of interactions. Taking warlike conflict as a general indicator of uniform codes of conduct, we do not see a single conduct for how interactions took place in the earliest hunter-gatherer societies, based on what evidence we do have, though the scarcity and contradictory nature of it has also given rise to an ongoing debate about whether structured interhuman conflict, which we might recognize as war, did actually take place at all. For what it's worth, the existence of contemporaneous cave paintings depicting interhuman conflict with weapons does suggest some ad hoc instances of either raids or impromptu battles over food. But the lack of war wounds on archaeological findings and rapid migration suggests that it would not have been widespread or systematic, thus pointing to more ad hoc relations generally. As an aside, this is also notably done on an intergroup level rather than between individuals. Psychologically, it appears nigh impossible that, in the presence of a structure where only individuals exist without a social order, a homogeneous approach to social interactions can exist based on the heterogeneous psychological profiles we can routinely observe. The only way this could be reconciled is to suggest that these heterogeneous profiles emerge from civilization, which at surface level appears counterintuitive, as civilization would be introducing social norms to be adhered to. What is the alternative then? Well, that somewhat depends on questions that I cannot conclusively answer. Do the ideas upon which civilization is based exist as entities outside of the mind of the humans that live inside them? Concepts like ordered hierarchies might find parallel in nature, but as that of differentiated physical properties leading to disparate and orderable levels of suitability for different purposes. The issue, however, is whether this can be claimed as an objective assessment or merely a subjective one, taking our framings and applying them where they seem to vaguely fit. The issue, then, is whether that, although we can make some statements about the ordering of these relevant phenomenon, which I will discuss in a moment, it is difficult to say in the absolute whether we may simply alter the wording slightly such that the same idea may apply equally well to whatever came before humanity, and whether that entity underwent the same process. Judging this is, of course, somewhat difficult in itself, but if we assume that recognition of self via the mirror test is a necessary predicate to rational individualism, then we find that it is a relatively uncommon feature among life on Earth, and at that, much less common than social structures reminiscent of primitive society, with features such as hierarchy, reciprocity, something approaching property recognition, and in-group/out-group distinctions. This is all in various combinations, of course. Ergo, before the development of an individualistic sense of self and the ability to rationally model future behaviours in a way that might give rise to society on a rational grounding, the society already existed in a primitive form. Therefore, rather than the conventional understanding that individuals create societies, it would be more accurate to instead state that society gave rise to individuals, and as such, in our timeline, appears to be more foundationally important.